What does the food supply have to do with our microbiome? Find out on this next episode of Digest This.
Welcome to Digest This, the show that helps you revolutionize your digestive health. Here are your hosts, Dr. Liz Cruz and Tina Nunziato.
Hello and welcome to Digest This. I'm Dr. Liz Cruz and I've got Tina Nunziato sitting right here by my side. If you're watching us on YouTube, we're so appreciative and thankful and grateful that you are on this journey with us. If you're a first-time listener, boy, are you in for a treat today. If you're one of our regular listeners, boy, are you in for a treat. We're just so excited that you're here. So let's jump right in because we've got an exciting episode for you. We have a very special guest. Her name is Martha Carlin. And she found us, and we were so excited that she found us and that we're going to podcast together. And who knows, this may be the beginning of a very long-lasting relationship. Beautiful relationship. That's right. So Martha Carlin has an amazing story. I'm going to let her talk about it. This is an accountant turned scientist. You're like, what? Yes, accountant turned scientist. Beautiful story. And so we're going to definitely let her talk about that.
Yes. So Martha, we're going to just start a little bit with your story first, and then we're going to dive into the topic that we had talked about the food supply and how it affects the microbiome. But before we get into that, just introduce yourself to everybody and just talk about your journey into science.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited about this. So my name is Martha Carlin. I am the CEO and founder of a company called the BioCollective, which looked at the human microbiome. But if I just back up about 22 years, well, actually even further than that, I graduated with a degree in accounting from college. And in accounting, everything has to balance. When I graduated, I went to work for a company called Arthur Andersen and was trained in a process called transaction flow review, which is how you look for risk in a business. And so what you do is you draw these maps and flow charts of everything that's flowing through the business and who touches it. And they also teach you to never take anything at face value and always examine the evidence for yourself. And so you go through that process of interviewing people and asking questions and looking for what might actually be broken that could cause risk in the business. Then fast forward years later, my young husband, he was 44 years old, in 2002 was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And he was a very otherwise healthy, lean, marathon running, young father. And it just didn't make any sense to me. And the neurologists are like, it's a progressive disease. There's nothing you can do. Here's a pill, kind of go away. Mm-hmm. And I looked at it and I said, I think this is a systems problem and I need to take my transaction flow approach. And so I started to kind of map out, like, what are the major flows through the body? And of course, the main flow through the body is food. So I started with the food supply and spent many years looking at how we grow our food, what we're doing to our food, how we preserve our food, and how that might impact his health. And then in 2014, the first paper was published that showed they could actually divide Parkinson's by the bacteria in the gut. There are two primary types. One is tremor dominant and the other is posture and gait dominant. And they could tell that by the difference in the bacteria. And that's the year I first heard the term, the microbiome. And I was like, wow, that's just like the general ledger in accounting. Mm-hmm. And I quit my job and started funding some research at the University of Chicago. And a few months later, actually founded the BioCollective with one of the researchers at the University of Chicago and my other co-founder, Suzanne Vernon. And we started collecting people's poop and looking for patterns and drawing those flow charts.
Wow.
And, now it's 9 years later, and a lot more has come out of it, and we've really moved far beyond just looking at Parkinson's into, the broader population and what we're doing to the human microbiome.
That's amazing.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What did you, and I'm just curious, before we really dive into our topic, so with that research that you started doing, what did you start doing for your husband then? Start giving him probiotics?
So, the first couple of years, we were just taking samples and sequencing his microbiome and looking at what was going on. He's probably one of the most sequenced people on the planet. I think we've sequenced over 150 whole genome sequences, and
oh my
those are
goodness.
pretty expensive. So you can imagine I spent a lot of money on poop. But I started the company in 2014. In 2016. I actually went to a Parkinson's conference where they showed that the sugar alcohol mannitol could stop the aggregation of the proteins, and in a mouse model could pull them out of the brain. And I came back and bought a mannitol chemistry book and started looking at it and looking at the microbes that actually convert other sugars into mannitol, and made a prototype probiotic for him that was customized for him to make mannitol in his gut from glucose and fructose. And then we started measuring, and we could see at that time he was walking with a cane, and within a month he was no longer walking with a cane. And
wow.
Our measurements of the changes in his microbiome over the next 120 days, we could see it was continuing to remodel closer and closer to the healthy human microbiome.
That's amazing. Oh my goodness. Do you have, before then, now you've been doing research, but did you have background at all in any sort of research before you started this journey?
No, not in scientific research, although I would say, auditing and running a business and business turnaround is kind of like scientific research.
Sure.
In a different sort of way. But no, I hired PhD scientists and learned from them along the way, and took courses in genetics and things so that I could understand at a deeper and deeper level what we were looking at.
Yeah.
Talk about engaging with your healthcare. I love it. I love it. Well, yeah, thank you for finding us and wanting to podcast with us and share your journey, because I know a lot of our patients have either themselves or their family members suffering from Parkinson's. So it's always good to have other resources and know what other people are doing out there for this. But we specifically wanted to talk to you today about just what your experience has been in the food supply. I know that was one of the top things that you like to talk about, is the food supply and how it affects the microbiome. So go ahead and start, just kind of dive in, and then we'll ask some questions along the way.
Well, so early on, so John had actually been drinking a soy protein shake for about 2 years every day, before he was diagnosed. And so I kind of instinctively had this sense that there might have been something wrong with soy. And he was also drinking soy milk instead of dairy milk. And so I actually dug pretty deeply into soy, and that's what led me to understanding all the chemicals that are used in agriculture. And really, at the forefront of that is glyphosate, or Roundup is the commercial name for, the home gardener who's spraying weeds. But, glyphosate is widely used in corn and soy. And ultimately, I was looking at it for many years before, the microbiome came along. But in the past 6 or 7 years, there's been extensive research showing that glyphosate actually is detrimental to the lactobacillus and bifidobacteria of the gut, and actually the pathogens are more resistant to it. So you're selecting for a less healthy microbiome the more glyphosate you are exposed to. And back in 1997, mostly just corn and soy were the crops that were using glyphosate. Mm-hmm. But now there are, I think, about 70 crops where they use it at the end of the harvest to dry the crop uniformly. It's called, I think it's called dry down or their desiccation. Mm-hmm. And so that's things like chickpeas and lentils, like all your beans, mm-hmm. grains like barley and wheat and, any of those grains where they want to dry them in the field very uniformly so they can harvest faster. Wow. But what happens when you're spraying that at the end of harvest, there's even more of that residue mm-hmm. left on the food. And I think that's really one of the major contributors to why we're having so many issues across the population mm-hmm. with gut health. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's so many things. I mean, honestly, you're just touching on one thing. I remember when Liz and I first started on our journey, we learned about Roundup and Monsanto mm-hmm. and GMO crops in general. But there's just so much behind that, right? And so many other things too. But it's just amazing to me that these things are allowed to continue to be done in this country.
It is pretty shocking, and then the other kind of big player on the food side, and I think it's also become more prevalent, I'll say, in the last 5 years or so, where we have a lot more fresh packaged foods. So, people think pre-chopped, or, even different types of vegetable dips or things that you get that are already prepared at the grocery store. Mm-hmm. People think of those as being healthy foods, but in order for them to maintain their shelf life, they have to use antibiotic or anti-enzymatic ingredients. So they will put those in there to keep the food from breaking down. Mm-hmm. But of course, the more of that you eat, that's also going to interfere with breaking down the food as you are trying to digest it, because you are eating an anti-enzymatic ingredient.
So it's pretty scary, right? It just makes you wonder, okay, so what can we eat? What is safe to eat? Because we go shopping at what we consider to be a wholesome grocery store with mostly organic products. I mean, so like the beans, when you can buy bulk or just in a package, dried beans like chickpeas. So are you saying that those could, be powdered with this chemical?
Well, so I think in most cases, if you are buying if you're buying organic dried chickpeas, mm-hmm. in most cases, those are not going to be using that in the dry down, in the desiccation process. Okay. But I do think there are exceptions that may allow for that. And that's actually one of the things on my list to look into in terms of the regulatory framework about that, mm-hmm. because they're actually not used in the growing of the crop. So sometimes there's these tiny little loopholes mm-hmm. that a big producer can get around, and people wouldn't be aware of it. But I think for the most part, if you are if you're getting an organic product, it's probably not going to be there.
It's going to be cleaner than not,
right? Basically. What about? Could we go back to soy? Because soy is a big thing. I mean, there's all forms of different soy now. The meats, or the vegetarian meats that are soy based, tofu. I mean, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think vegans are actually probably at a very much higher risk of detrimental glyphosate exposure, because so many of the products that they are eating are very likely exposed to glyphosate more so than, say, somebody who's on a carnivore diet, mm-hmm. where the cows are also exposed to it in their feed often. but it's already been through kind of a breakdown and processing in the animal, so it's not going to be as concentrated, I would say. Soy is pretty interesting. There was a book, I think it was called The Whole Soy Story. It's a very thick book about the history of soybeans as a industry, really, and a number of the ingredients that are used quite frequently now were actually waste from the soybeans.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You're just making it. We're like deep in thought here.
So Martha, what type of diet do you and your husband eat now?
So 2 years ago, we moved to a farm so that we could have our own cows,
nice,
our own chickens and eggs, and grow as much of our own vegetables as we can. I mean, I can't say that I'm the best farmer in the world, but we have a pretty good choice over the summertime when we're actually growing. But John has actually been on what's called a lipid replacement diet for the last 6 months, and that's a pretty focused diet that leans more ketogenic. But there's a list of vegetables that he's allowed to have, and so we're very focused on those vegetables, but only a handful of fruits. So he's only allowed to have papaya and kiwi and cherries if they are fresh in season. So that actually has been very helpful for his gut and a number of things. So I think kind of going back to not just soy, but also canola, those seed oils, they're also a food ingredient in many, many foods now, and most of the salad dressings and that sort of thing. And there's more and more research now showing how detrimental the seed oils are to our cellular membranes if they're getting incorporated into our cellular membranes. So, that's another thing that we really avoid that I didn't know about for, I would say the first 12 to 14 years that John had Parkinson's. I was still using seed oil until maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
And what are you using now?
So we use olive oil. We use tallow, beef tallow, duck fat. I mean, so more animal fat, which, for decades, people were sort of warned away from saturated fats. But we use butter and ghee. But we also try to avoid as much as possible heating the oil. So if we're adding oil, we're adding it at the end of the cooking process rather than at the beginning, because you also get that denaturing of the oils in the heating process.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot too, just doing more steaming and then putting the oil after. So yeah, that's definitely something.
What about coconut oil?
Oh, coconut oil. Yes, he does use coconut oil. I forgot about that.
Okay.
So, and there's definitely, some key pieces of the puzzle that I'm still working to educate myself and unwind in terms of the chain length of those fatty acids.
Now, so he was diagnosed over 20 years ago then. Yes?
22 years ago.
22 years ago. Okay. So, and how has his Parkinson's progressed with all of these efforts?
So it's been very interesting. There have been periods of setback, and then we've learned something new or done something new, as in 2016 with the with the probiotic I made. Actually, going back even to 2010, we returned from a meeting in Australia, and he was very, very sick. Actually, it was not Parkinson's related. They never could figure out what it was, but they treated him with a very strong antibiotic for about 6 weeks after searching for 4 months to figure out what it was. And that actually had pretty significant improvement on his Parkinson's, which is, I mean, the evidence is kind of strange to me in some ways. So I do think that 6-week course of antibiotic definitely knocked back some of the pathogens that are implicated in Parkinson's. But there's also research from Dr. Philip Schepperhans, who became a friend of mine, who's in Finland and has done a lot of the groundbreaking microbiome research on Parkinson's. And he was able to do a meta-analysis, because in Finland they have all the medical records of everyone from birth to death, and showed a correlation with certain types of antibiotics and certain antifungals and the development of Parkinson's disease.
Meaning the use of them developed Parkinson's, or it helped Parkinson's?
Developed Parkinson's.
Okay.
Interesting.
So, and I also have this sort of oddball characteristic of anytime I meet somebody with Parkinson's, asking them to tell me their life story and different exposures and this sort of thing. And so I've taken notes of that, or, some of them written, some of them mental. But what I found was many of them had a history in their childhood of chronic strep infections and multiple courses of antibiotics. So that actually led me, I went to 23andMe, and they were able to look in their database. They have these very in-depth questionnaires, and they have a lot of Parkinson's people in their data set. And they did find that people who had 4 or more strep infections had a higher risk of Parkinson's.
Wow. And when they're young, because we
often with the antibiotic exposure, you get this GI disruption.
Yes.
And chronic constipation is actually a prodromal symptom of Parkinson's anywhere from 10 to 15 years prior to a Parkinson's diagnosis. Someone will start having chronic, severe constipation. And that's something often, like, a neurologist doesn't really maybe understand fully what that means. And it was interesting for us when we were collecting people's stool sample, because when we collected the samples, we collected the entire stool. Most people who do a stool kit, it's just a little swab that you put in a tube or something. Well, we took the whole shoot and match. And so the people in our lab who were processing the samples actually told me, after, it's probably a year after we had started collecting samples, but they said, we can tell if somebody has Parkinson's just from looking at their poop.
Wow.
Without
crazy.
any other information about them. And they could not process the Parkinson's samples the same way as they processed all the others, because it was like concrete.
Wow.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, and we remember when we did a bunch of when we were learning too on our journey, we were learning about children's exposure to antibiotics very young and how it affects the gut. Because when you're young, that bacteria in the gut is so crucial for proper healthy development, not only for the GI tract but for the whole body, right? And the immune system. And so it's interesting that your research and the things that you're finding is correlating to a lot of what we've learned, and how we educate our patients. So this is amazing. Well, Martha, thank you for joining us. We're definitely going to have you on future podcasts. I know Martha's website is Martha's Quest for anyone that wants to connect with her. And we would love to have her on more and talk about I know she's got so many different topics that she can talk about, so we'd love to do that with her. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If you haven't subscribed, please go out and subscribe to the show. Please give us a 5-star so other people just like you can connect with us. And we will catch you on the next podcast.
Thank you for joining Dr. Liz Cruz and Tina Nunziato. To learn more about their revolutionary products and services, go online to www.drlizcruz.com.